The station was gone before anyone could say a word. One moment, Callisto Mining Outpost 7 was a cluster of warm lights on my scanner. A small, steady pulse of human life sitting 300,000 kilometers above Jupiter's northern pole. 32 years of continuous operation. The people inside had drilled into the ice, extracted minerals, sent them back to Earth on scheduled freighters, and gone to sleep every night in bunks bolted to metal walls with Jupiter, filling every viewport like something ancient and indifferent. They had done this for 32 years without incident. They had built a community. They had put photographs on their locker doors and argued about food in the cafeteria and celebrated birthdays in the common room with whoever happened to be on shift. The next moment, the station was a cloud of burning debris spreading slowly across the dark. No warning, no transmitted demand, no time for the 312 people inside to reach an evacuation pod. A beam of white energy appeared from nowhere, lasted less than a second, and then there was silence on every frequency. I watched my scanner and the warm cluster of lights simply was not there. Where it had been, a thin and spreading field of debris moved outward in all directions, catching Jupiter's light. I sat in the command chair of the Relentless and could not move for 5 full seconds. My name is Commander Yara Ose. I have served in the United Nations Defense Force for 19 years. I have seen battle damage, hull breaches, engine fires that gutted ships from the inside. I have sat beside people while they died from wounds that came too fast to treat. I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood the shape of it. I did not understand anything yet. The transmission came 40 seconds after the station died. 3 words, translated into English with precise, almost careful grammar. The translation software flagged it as a first contact signal, which felt like a joke without a punchline. I read it twice on my screen. Then I read it a third time aloud quietly to see if saying it changed anything. Submit or disperse. That was all. No identification, no context, no terms with a deadline attached. Just 3 words sent after the act, the way you slide a note under a door to explain something you have already done. My communications officer, Ensign Patrick Hale, turned in his seat and looked at me. He was 23 years old and his face had gone a pale, flat color I recognized as shock working through a person who had not been trained for this particular kind of moment. He opened his mouth and closed it. He was waiting for me to tell him what the words meant. I was waiting for myself to know. I keyed the ship-wide channel. My voice came out even, which surprised me. I told the crew we had made contact with an unknown force. I told them to go to combat readiness. I told them to do their jobs. Then I closed the channel and sat quietly for 10 seconds, looking at the debris field where Callisto Station used to be. One of the pieces drifting past my viewport was a personal locker door, still intact, tumbling slowly end over end in the way that objects tumble in vacuum when nothing is pushing them in any particular direction. Something was stuck to it, a photograph I thought at this distance. I could not see it clearly, but I knew someone had put it there. Someone had stood in a small metal room, taken a photograph out of an envelope or printed it from a personal file, and pressed it to their locker door. They had gone to sleep with that photograph as the last thing they saw and woken up with it as the first. They had assumed they would see it tomorrow. I pulled up the station manifest and started reading from the top. I found the name I recognized 3 pages in, Jeff Hartley, maintenance supervisor, age 58. His application for a transfer back to Earth had been submitted 6 weeks ago and approved. He was supposed to leave next month. Someone on the manifest team had flagged his entry with a departure date. I took out the small notebook I carry in my left breast pocket. Plain gray cover. Purchased at a stationer shop in Edinburgh when I was visiting my daughter before this deployment. Lucy had picked it out. She was 11 years old, and she had strong opinions about paper texture, and she had chosen this notebook because she liked the way the pages felt when she ran her thumb along the edge. I had bought it because she chose it, and it had been sitting in my pocket ever since with nothing written in. I opened it to the first page. I wrote Jeff Hartley's name. Then I opened a priority channel to Earth and waited. The response from Secretary General Adele Marsh came back in just under 11 minutes, which told me she had been sitting at her terminal since the first alert. Her voice was calm with the specific quality of calm that sits over something much colder and much larger. The way the surface of very deep water looks still, she said. Make them remember this Mabisca river. I closed the channel. I looked at the debris field for a long time. The thing about the human species is that we have a long and detailed history of being hurt, and a longer and more detailed history of what comes after. Not a comfortable history, not an admirable one in every chapter, but a consistent one in this specific way. We have been occupied and scattered and told repeatedly that we were finished. that this was as far as we were going, that what we were facing was too much for what we were. And every single time we came back, not because we are the most powerful thing available, because something in our biology or our culture or some combination of the two that no one has fully explained refuses to accept the conclusion that we are done. We grieve, we remember, we come back. The Veth Dominion was 400 years old. They spanned 43 star systems. They had never lost a war in 4 centuries of continuous expansion. Their strategic catalogs listed humanity as a Class 4 emergent species, meaning too young and too localized to pose any meaningful threat to an organized military force. They had looked at us through their instruments and concluded that 3 words would be sufficient to produce compliance. They were wrong about every part of that. In 48 hours, every orbital shipyard in the solar system shifted to full war production. No single order made this happen across the board. Individual facility commanders made individual decisions, and the decisions were all the same. In 72 hours, every colony beyond Mars had activated its defensive capacity and was requesting personnel and weapons. In 96 hours, the UNDF had more volunteers than it had ships. People were being turned away from enlistment offices and asking what else they could do. No announcement created this. No speech. People looked at what had happened to Callisto Station and made a decision, quietly and all at the same time. I spent the 4 days after the attack reading everything intelligence had on the Veth. Their ships used energy shielding centuries ahead of our current technology. Their primary weapons could cut through our best hull material at ranges that negated most of our standard tactics. Their warrior caste, the Keth, were bred for combat from birth and appeared to feel no fear in any form our psychologists could identify or measure. They had absorbed 112 other species in 4 centuries of expansion. 61 had tried to resist. All 61 had failed. The intelligence report's risk assessment was written in the careful hedging language of someone who knew the numbers were bad and was presenting them professionally. The probability of meaningful military resistance was 11% given current UNDF force projections. The probability of sustained resistance sufficient to alter the outcome was 3%. I read those numbers 3 times. Then I put the report on the table in my command room and called in my senior officers. Lieutenant Kara Webb, my intelligence officer, 26 years old, had been awake for nearly 40 hours and showed it only in a slight tightening around her eyes. Lieutenant Devlin Shaw, lead fighter pilot from Newcastle, came in already sketching on a paper pad with the focused energy of someone whose mind works fastest when his hands are moving. Dr. Alice Holt, ship's physician, 12 years of service, sat with her hands folded and her face entirely composed. Commander Barry Sutton, tactical officer from Cape Town, father of 3, was the quietest man I had ever worked alongside and the steadiest. I told them what I knew. I told them what the numbers said. I told them what we had been ordered to do. Nobody flinched. Nobody asked whether we could actually accomplish it. They had already decided the same thing I had, which was that whether we could was not the question that mattered right now. Shaw looked up from his sketching. He said the Veth fighter formations in the intelligence footage followed patterns. Very good patterns, technically sophisticated and precisely executed, but always the same patterns. Their combat AI was exceptional at adapting to variations in a recognized pattern. It was not designed for what he called sneeze evasion, he explained. Sneeze evasion is the flight path you get when a pilot is not following any doctrine but simply reacting to each immediate threat as it appears moment by moment without plan. No 2 paths are the same. No combat AI can predict them because they are genuinely unpredictable. They are not, strictly speaking, a rational strategy. They are the strategy of someone who is still alive and intends to keep being alive. He said this with the small satisfied expression he had when a problem had been solved to his standards. Webb said she had been running the Veth communications through deep analysis. She had found something she wanted to characterize carefully. The Veth appeared to have no concept of acceptable loss in the way we use that term. Every engagement in their recorded history had ended in one of 2 outcomes: surrender or destruction. They had never encountered an enemy that simply kept fighting after taking damage that should have ended the engagement. Their tactical models had no category for it. She said she thought this mattered more than any single engagement. I looked at my officers. I thought about Jeff Hartley. I thought about the photograph on the locker door. I thought about Adele Marsh's voice. I told my crew we were going to war. I told them I did not know how it would end, but I knew how it would begin, which was with everything we had, for as long as we had it. Sutton nodded once, the way he nodded when a decision had been made and the work could begin. Outside the viewport, The debris field was thinning, spreading wider with every passing hour. In a few weeks it would be invisible, dispersed into the background. Nothing would mark where it had been, but I would know. I closed my notebook. I put it back in my pocket. We had work to do. The Red Meridian Corridor was 14 million kilometers long and 3 million kilometers wide at its narrowest point. See, a natural gravitational channel between two asteroid clusters that made it the fastest transit route between Earth's outer defense perimeter and the Veth frontier. Both sides understood its value. The Veth patrolled it with a rotation schedule that Kara Webb had mapped over 6 weeks of silent observation, precise and consistent in the way that 4 centuries of uncontested routine makes everything precise and consistent. I brought 12 ships into the corridor 2 days before the expected patrol rotation, running cold with minimal power output. The Relentless and 11 others, holding position in the dark with engines at 15% and every non-essential system offline. We ate cold food and ran in red lighting and talked quietly and waited. Time moves differently when you are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. Shaw spent the waiting period in the fighter bay with his pilots, running sneeze evasion simulations on portable displays, their screens casting pale light in the darkened quarters. I passed through on the second day and found 6 pilots crowded around one screen, arguing in low, intent voices about approach angles. Shaw was in the center of it, drawing a flight path in the air with one finger, while explaining the difference between a random movement and an unpredictable one. A random movement has no logic, he was saying. An unpredictable movement has its own logic, but the logic cannot be found from outside. The distinction matters. The first is noise. The second is a pattern that looks like noise. Combat AI is very good at filtering out noise. It has no response to a pattern it cannot find. He looked up when he noticed me watching and gave me a small nod. I gave him one back. Then I walked on. The Veth patrol force arrived on schedule on the 3rd day, 8 ships in their standard sweep formation, moving through the corridor with the unhurried confidence of something that has done this 1,000 times without incident. Their sensor sweeps were thorough. On the second pass they came close enough to trigger an automated response from one of my power cores before I got the shutdown order through. And one of my crew told me afterward she had held her breath for 4 minutes and not noticed until she gasped when the beam moved on, but it moved on. I waited until they were deep in the corridor, past the point where a fast withdrawal back to the entry was the obvious response. Then I gave the signal. Every human ship activated simultaneously and broke in 12 different directions. What followed was the most intense 40 minutes of my military career to that point. The Veth were fast, genuinely fast in the way that a machine built specifically for a purpose is faster at that purpose than anything else. Their weapons came online in under 2 seconds. Their targeting systems locked onto my lead ships before I had finished the second order. They fired, and 2 of my ships took immediate hits that I registered on my board as damage readouts climbing, and I kept talking because stopping was not an option. Shaw's element went into sneeze evasion. I will describe this as accurately as I can because I think the description matters. From a tactical display it looked like 12 fighters simultaneously losing control. They scattered in directions that had no tactical logic. They crossed each other's flight paths. They changed heading mid-maneuver without coordination or apparent signal. One pilot flew directly at the largest Veth cruiser at full acceleration in what appeared to be a suicidal approach, held the line until the last possible instant, then broke hard to port and slid underneath the ship with 11 meters of clearance. As she went under, she fired twice into the ventral shield emitters at point-blank range. The cruiser's shields dropped in a sector. Sutton called the second element before I finished the order. He had been watching the same moment I had. The second element had been holding inside one of the asteroid clusters, invisible because their power cores were cycled below any detection threshold I had ever seen in operational conditions. Sutton had run the timing calculations 6 times, and then a 7th. He was sitting at his console when I looked at him after the signal went, and he did not look at me. He was already moving his hands, adjusting the firing solution for the gap that Shaw's pilot had just opened. The second element came in from 3 directions at once. What followed was a 30-minute fight through the debris and the geometry of the corridor, with the Veth scrambling to cover their flanks while Shaw's fighters kept opening new angles and my second element kept driving through them. The Veth were disciplined. Their response was faster than I had expected, even knowing how fast they were. They had the Relentless bracketed twice, and both times Sutton found an angle that made them break off before they could hold the solution. The third time they almost had us. A concentrated broadside, that I watched coming on the tactical display with the particular clarity of moments when there is simply nothing to do except hold your position and keep giving orders. And the shot came in 5 degrees off angle, cause one of Shaw's pilots had appeared directly in front of the firing ship at the last second, and the targeting system had broken to track the immediate threat. Shaw's pilot came out the far side of the engagement with 3 of his 4 thrusters, destroyed, and was recovered 4 hours later. He walked out of the recovery bay with his flight suit still on and went directly back to the briefing room. We lost 2 ships. The Argent caught a concentrated broadside from the Veth's second cruiser when her approach angle left her exposed at a moment when her covering element had been drawn off by a feint. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. The Wren took a glancing hit that compromised her reactor shielding, and the cascade failure moved faster than her crew had time to respond to. I heard both ships on the comms channel. Noise, then static, then nothing. I noted them in my peripheral awareness. I kept my eyes on the battle. I kept talking. The Veth lost 7 ships. The last one ran at maximum speed toward the corridor exit, and I let it go. I wanted it to go. I wanted it to file a report. I wanted the words unexpected casualties to appear in a Veth after-action report, and I wanted those words to travel up the command chains until they reached people who had been certain that 3 words would be sufficient. When it was over the bridge, held a slit that lasted 4 seconds. Then Sutton started calling the damage assessment, and everyone moved. Kara Webb came to stand beside my command chair. She held out a tablet with a fragment of a Veth transmission captured in the last seconds of the patrol's command ship. The translation was incomplete and parts were corrupted. But one phrase had come through: unexpected casualties. 'Cause under review. I read it twice. 400 years, 112 species. They had never had to write those words before. I handed the tablet back. I gave orders for damage assessment and after-action reporting. Then I went to my cabin and wrote the names of the Argent and the Wren in my notebook. As many crew members as I could confirm from the manifest. I wrote them carefully. Over the following 8 weeks we hit the Veth 14 more times along the outer system boundary and the adjacent frontier corridors. We won 9 engagements and lost 5. We took casualties in all 14. The weight of names in my notebook grew steadily, and I kept my promise that every name would mean something, and worked every day to make that true. But alongside the losses, something was changing in the Veth response that was small and precise and significant. Kara Webb brought me the full analysis at the end of week 8. She had been accessing Veth after-action reports through a captured communication frequency they had not yet changed. She laid out the data with her characteristic precision. The language in the reports was evolving. Early in the war, unexpected outcomes were logged once under operational variance. By week 8 they were being elevated to command review, which in the Veth hierarchy meant something far more serious. Commanders were being asked to explain their results. The phrase "the enemy's behavior does not conform to established engagement parameters" was appearing in multiple documents. 23 separate reports in 8 weeks, all containing some version of that phrase. I sat with this information for a while after she gave it to me. I thought about what it meant. 400 years of expansion, 112 species absorbed. Not once, in all of that history, had the Dominion needed to review its doctrine. The doctrine had always worked, because the enemies had always eventually behaved the way the doctrine predicted enemies would behave. We were not behaving that way. Part of it was Shaw and his pilots. We were not fighting from a playbook that could be studied and countered. We were inventing responses to each situation as the situation developed, and an enemy whose tactical architecture had been refined against predictable patterns had no mechanism for predicting what we would do next because we often did not know ourselves until we were doing it. Part of it was something I found harder to name precisely but understood clearly enough to work with. Every species the Veth had ever fought had eventually reached the threshold that Velkorath would later describe to me, the point where continued resistance cost more than it could return. Humanity had not reached this threshold. The threshold kept moving because every loss was another name in my notebook, and every name in my notebook was another reason that stopping was not something I could accept. This was not irrationality. It was the most rational available calculation given what had been done to us and what would follow if we stopped. It was a logic the Veth had no model for. I recorded personal logs for Lucy every few days. I described Jupiter from 6 different angles because she had asked me to. I told her about the crew and said I was eating and sleeping adequately, both of which were approximately true. I did not tell her about the Argent and the Wren or about the 7 crew members lost to a hull breach in the second engagement. I did not tell her about the 4 hours in the sixth engagement when Shaw's transponder went offline, and I sat in my command chair, with my voice completely even, and my face completely still, because 38 people on my bridge were watching, and I could not let them see what those 4 hours were doing to me inside. She sent me recordings about school, and about her cat, and about the book she was reading, and about a disagreement she was having with a classmate over the correct solution to a particular kind of math problem. She had explained her solution 3 times, she said, and he kept insisting she was wrong. She asked my opinion. I listened to the recording twice and smiled both times. Shaw came up to the command deck after the 14th engagement, still in his flight suit, with a new burn mark on his left arm that he had not mentioned in any status report and did not mention now. He sat across from me at the command table and drank a cup of water and looked at me with the expression he wore when he was working through something he had not finished yet. He said, "Do you think they know yet what they started?" I said, "They are beginning to. They do not have the full picture yet." He nodded. He looked at the burn mark without any particular expression. Then he got up and went to debrief his pilots. I took out my notebook. I wrote the date of the 14th engagement. I closed it and put it back in my pocket. We were not winning the war yet. We were very far from winning the war. But we had done something that no other species had managed in 4 centuries of dominion expansion. We had introduced uncertainty into a military culture that had built its entire strategic doctrine on the premise of certainty, on the reliable equation of overwhelming force applied to predictable enemies producing predetermined outcomes. The equation was failing. We were just getting started. The thing about momentum in a long conflict is that it builds before you can fully see it building. Each engagement, each report filed, each small adjustment in the interval between Veth weapons activation and targeting lock, each new document in their internal review pile was individually small. Together, they were accumulating into something that would eventually become irreversible. I could not see the whole shape of it yet, but I could feel it in the way you feel a current changing direction in deep water before the surface shows any sign of it. 23 cracks. We were going to need more. The weeks between the Red Meridian engagement and the operation we called Long Memory were not quiet weeks. They were the kind of busy that leaves no room for any other kind of thinking, which I suspected was the point. Shaw ran his pilots through scenario after scenario, not just sneeze evasion, but what he called the grammar of chaos, the underlying principles that made unpredictable movement a genuine tactical tool rather than just panic with better execution. He had developed a series of exercises where pilots had to navigate obstacle courses using only their immediate reactions to what appeared in front of them, training themselves to stop pre-planning routes and trust their reflex decisions in the moment. It produced better results in training than any doctrine-based approach we had tried, and in actual engagements the difference was visible. Sutton spent those weeks redesigning our firing solutions from the ground up. The standard UNDF approach to weapons targeting was built for the kind of engagement we had never been having. 2 forces approaching each other in known formation, exchanging fire in established sequence. What we were doing instead required continuous recalculation as the geometry changed, which in practice meant Sutton was running new solutions every 30 to 60 seconds during a live engagement. He did not talk about this. He just did it. I watched him at his console during the 6th engagement and counted 11 full solution updates in 14 minutes while simultaneously managing the tactical channel and calling adjustments to 3 different ships. He looked like a person who had found the exact limits of what he was capable of and had decided to operate there permanently. Kara Webb, meanwhile, was building something she called the hesitation file. Every Veth after-action report that came through the captured frequency, every flagged review, every instance of the phrase unexpected casualties or its variations. She was not just counting them. She was analyzing the content, looking for what specific events triggered the flags, which engagement types produced the most significant responses, which commanders filed the most reviews, and what their command histories looked like. She was building a picture of the Veth military's internal uncertainty in the way an intelligence officer builds any picture, by accumulating enough specific data points that the shape becomes visible. She brought me the hesitation file analysis at the end of week 7. The picture it showed was not of a military that was close to breaking. It would have been wrong to describe it that way, and I told her so when she showed it to me. The Veth were still formidable, still coordinated, still capable of bringing overwhelming force to bear on any single target we presented them with. What the file showed was a military in which the certainty that had underpinned every decision for 4 centuries was developing inconsistencies, not cracks wide enough to collapse anything, but cracks. I thought about what meant that cracks were appearing in certainty, rather than in capability. Their ships were still superior. Their weapons were still superior. Their numbers were still superior. What was changing was the internal confidence with which their commanders approached the question of engagement. And in a military culture built on the premise that overwhelming force applied to predictable enemies produces predetermined outcomes, internal uncertainty about the predictability of the enemy was more corrosive than any amount of hardware loss. It meant that the doctrine itself was starting to fail, not just in individual engagements, but in the minds of the people executing it. I wrote about this in my personal log, not the tactical analysis, which was Webb's to write formally, but my understanding of what we were doing to them and why it mattered. I wanted to have it recorded in my own words, because I was not certain we would survive to discuss it later, and I thought the understanding should exist somewhere. I also wrote about Shaw, who I had watched after the 6th engagement sitting alone in the hangar, with his hand on the nose of his fighter and his eyes somewhere else, entirely for the 20 minutes it took the repair crews to finish the post-flight checks. I had walked past and not stopped because I thought that was the right call. Some things a person needs to do in their own company. I understood this. I practiced it myself. The accumulation of all of it, the tactics and the intelligence and the personal cost, was building towards something I could feel, without being able to fully see. Like pressure building in a system before a release point. Like a current changing direction in deep water before the surface shows any sign of it. We were not there yet. We had a long way still to go. But something had changed in the character of the war, in a way that was real, even when it was not yet measurable. The intelligence came in 3 hours before the Veth fleet appeared on our sensors, which meant we knew it was coming and still could not fully prepare for it. Kara Webb walked into the tactical briefing at a speed that stopped every conversation in the room before she opened her mouth. She placed the report on the table and stood there. I read it. I held the numbers in my head for a moment to confirm I had read them correctly. 1,200 warships. The Veth Supreme War Council had authorized a full mobilization, the largest military deployment the Dominion had made in 2 centuries of recorded operations. 1,200 ships directed at a single target, the supply corridor connecting Earth's inner colony network to our outer defense lines. Our supply convoys moved through it every 72 hours. Our repair ships, our replacement crews, every unit of fuel and every piece of equipment that kept our fleet operational. Without it, we could sustain operations for approximately 3 weeks before ships began failing from simple attrition. Equipment we could not repair because we could not get parts through. They had identified the correct target. I looked at my fleet strength. 214 ships, approximately 160 combat-ready against serious opposition. I looked at the 3 approaches to the corridor entry, each large enough for a formation of 200 ships moving simultaneously. I looked at the window between the intelligence report and the arrival of the fleet. 61 hours. The command conference lasted 14 hours. The plan that emerged was not elegant because elegance requires options and we did not have options. Only a situation and a set of assets and the requirement to find something that worked within those constraints. What we found was a refusal to fight the battle the Veth had planned for. They expected entry point defense. They had designed their formation around it. We were not going to give them what they had designed around. We split the fleet into 12 elements and moved them inside the corridor, deep inside, running completely silent. No communication, no signals of any kind, minimum power output. Every ship powered down to life support and barely enough propulsion to hold position. 12 elements, 72 hours of silence. Positioned at 12 separate points within the body of the corridor while the Veth fleet filled it from outside. Each captain had a sealed physical envelope. One sentence inside. They would open it when the timer reached 0. We let them come in. All 1,200 ships moved into the corridor in their precise, coordinated formation. The confident and unhurried formation of an overwhelming force that has never had a reason to doubt itself. They came in slowly by Veth doctrine. Maximum formation cohesion, every ship in its designated position. The corridor was empty in front of them. They advanced. I was behind an asteroid cluster 30 kilometers from the main column. When my timer reached 0, I opened the envelope. 1 sentence. I broadcast the activation signal. Close the door. All 12 elements activated at the same moment from 12 positions inside the Veth formation. 11 hours is too long and too dense to describe in full. What I can say accurately is what it was designed to be and what it achieved. It was designed to make us impossible to deal with. 12 simultaneous engagements inside the body of the fleet, in positions that prevented the Veth from bringing concentrated force to bear on any single element without risking their own ships in the lines of fire. Their command authorization chain required orders to travel up the hierarchy before they could be issued to local commanders, and that chain was too slow for engagements that changed their geometry every few minutes. By the time a local commander received authorization to respond to what was in front of them had changed. The Relentless took the first serious hit at 40 minutes. A Veth cruiser had cleared a firing lane and caught us on the port side, knocking out our forward shields and putting half of Deck 3 into hard vacuum. I felt the ship shudder through the deck and watched the readouts cascade and kept giving orders, because there was nothing else to do in stopping. Ban was not possible. Sutton was rerouting power before I finished the sentence. Holt was in the medical bay before I reached the next one. I noticed, with a distant part of my attention, that I was afraid. Not paralyzingly or prominently, just present underneath the work, the way cold is present when you are focused on something else entirely. I acknowledged it and went back to the tactical display. The worst period came between hours 5 and 7. 3 ships went dark in 40 minutes. The second element, which had been the most exposed of the 12, lost 2 ships in quick succession when a Veth dreadnought managed to establish a firing coordination through a backup channel that the intelligence data had not flagged. I called for covering movement from the third element, and the third element was already executing it, their captain having read the same geometry at the same moment without needing a signal. That happened several times in those 11 hours. Decisions made simultaneously by people who had been fighting together long enough to absorb something of each other's tactical instincts. I do not have a formal name for what that is. I know it felt like something more than coordination. At hour 8, the Veth began pulling back. Organized, disciplined, with the professional competence of a military that had lost the engagement but not its function. They pulled toward the corridor entry and regrouped at the outer edge of their original formation. They were not routed. They were reassessing. We had lost 51 ships. The corridor was open. I was standing at the viewport when my damage control officer reported a hull breach at Deck 7, Section 4. Routine repair queue item. I noted it. Then my bridge door opened. 2 figures in Veth boarding armor, weapons already drawn. They had cut through the breach section during the post-battle management period, when every report was competing with every other report, and a secondary hull breach on a damaged deck was not the immediate priority it would have been in a quieter moment. Patient, professional work. They had planned this during the withdrawal. I had exactly no time. I woke up in a cell that smelled like metal and something biological I could not identify. Hands bound in front of me, not behind, which I registered and filed. A dried crust along my right temple where I had been cut. Flat, constant lighting. Metal floor with a drain. No visible door mechanism. My notebook was gone from my pocket. That was the thing I noticed most clearly after I finished the inventory of the cell. I felt the empty pocket like a small and specific absence. The Keth guard came twice the first day, tall gray-green, with the independent eye movement of something engineered from prey into predator. It looked at me with the professional attention of something trained to contain, not to communicate. It did not speak. On the second day, Velkorath came. He entered with 2 staff members and dismissed them immediately. He sat on a bench his aide brought and looked at me for a long time before speaking. I looked back. I was in the process of making assessments, and I did not want to waste the looking. He said he wanted to understand something. He said the Dominion had encountered 112 species at various stages of development. He said 61 had attempted armed resistance. He said every single one had eventually reached a threshold where the cost of continued resistance exceeded any conceivable benefit, and they had stopped. He said humanity appeared not to have this threshold, and he wanted to understand the mechanism behind its absence. I took a moment after he finished before answering. I said, "You destroyed a civilian station without warning. You killed 312 people who were miners and technicians and maintenance workers. You sent 3 words. You did not offer terms or negotiation or any version of a future in which we existed on terms we could accept. You told us to submit or leave. When we did neither, you came to kill us. You gave us nothing to stop fighting for. Every offer you have made since has been conditional on our becoming something you control. The cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. That is the mechanism." He was quiet for a while. He said, "Every species eventually chooses survival over continued resistance." I said, "We are not choosing between survival and resistance. You have made them the same thing. As long as you remain capable of acting as you acted at Callisto Station, stopping is not surviving. It is waiting to be finished differently. And the threshold you are looking for moves every time you give us a new reason, because this is not primarily a calculation about fear. It is a calculation about debt. We are carrying names. Names of people who did not survive what you started. Every one of those names is a reason the threshold moves. He considered this. He said, "That is not a rational calculation." I said, "It is the most rational calculation available to us given the specific situation you created. You have been studying species whose survival calculus optimizes around fear. Fear has a threshold. Debt does not work the same way." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "What would it take to make you stop?" I said, "Go back in time and make a different choice at Callisto Station." I know that is not a useful answer, but it is the true one. There is no offer on the table that returns those 312 people. The only path to an end to this that I can accept involves changes beyond a ceasefire, structural changes, which is a conversation that happens at a level above mine. He stood. He said, "I believe you are describing an enemy that cannot be defeated by conventional means," I said. "I believe you are correct." He left. I spent 7 days in that cell. I used the time. The first 2 days I mapped everything mappable. The cell's acoustics told me about adjacent spaces. The guard rotation told me about shift structure. And the small variations in behavior between guards told me about which ones were experienced and which were not. The lighting cycles, though constant in the cell itself, had secondary effects on the sounds of the ship around me. Vibrations and mechanical signatures that changed slightly at different points in what I estimated was a 24-hour cycle. On the 3rd and 4th days I began the performance. Less food, less movement. Shorter answers when spoken to, and the answers shorter each time. The progressive and visible picture of someone whose resources were running out. The guard was competent but not imaginative. It noted what it saw and updated its assessment. This was what I needed it to do. On the 6th day I considered the plan fully and accepted what it was going to cost. On the 7th day the guard came with my food allocation and turned to leave, and I called out. I made my voice small and deliberate. I said I was ready to cooperate. I said I had fleet position information. I said it the way someone says something they are ashamed of. The guard left. It came back with a communication terminal. 4 minutes inside the Veth Strategic Communication Archive. I found the master framework files in under 2 minutes. Started the compression and broadcast sequence on every on-DF frequency within range. And the alarm activated 8 seconds before the transmission finished. The transmission finished. What followed was not pleasant, and I will not describe it in detail. 2 days later, cutting equipment came through the hull, and Kara Webb's face appeared in the opening, and she looked at me for 1 full second in silence. Then she said I looked terrible. I said I was aware. She handed me my notebook. They had found it in an evidence locker 3 decks up. I put it back in my pocket and felt something settle that had been wrong since I woke up in the cell. The file had transmitted. The names were still there. We had a great deal of work to do. What I did not write down, because I was not certain of it at the time, was what I understood from Velkorath during those 7 days that went beyond the specific conversations we had. I understood it the way you understand something in a physical, bodily way before you have the words for it. Velkorath was an intelligent being who had spent his entire adult life operating within a military and cultural framework built on a specific set of premises about how conflict worked. Those premises had been reliable for 4 centuries. They had never produced an outcome that required them to be revised. And now they were producing outcomes he could not explain from within the framework, and the framework was the only tool he had. He was not stupid. He was not evil in any way I could identify from those conversations. He was someone who had built his entire understanding of his world on a foundation that was failing, and who was intelligent enough to perceive that it was failing, and not yet sure what to do with that perception. I thought about this in the cell a great deal. I thought about what it would mean to give him a different framework, not as a charitable act, but as a practical one. An enemy who can conceive of ending a conflict on terms that are not pure victory or pure destruction is easier to stop than one who cannot. An enemy who understands why the conflict started, and what it would take to address those reasons at a structural level is, paradoxically, more tractable than one who does not. I was not going to offer him a different framework in that cell. The time and the circumstances were wrong for it. But I filed the perception away because I thought it would matter later. The days in the cell were also, in a specific and difficult way, useful for something I had not been giving myself enough time to do. I had been in continuous operational mode for months, the cell forced to stop. I could not give orders, I could not review tactical displays. I could not call briefings or write reports or make decisions about fleet positioning. There was nothing to do except think and wait and execute the plan I had made. In the thinking, I went through every name in my notebook from memory, because the notebook was gone and I needed to keep the names somewhere. I went through them in order, and I held each one for a moment. I thought about what I knew about who each person had been. The specific details, not the rank in the ship but the person. Jeff Hartley's approved transfer request. Sutton's children's photographs on his console. Shaw's habit of sketching in briefings when he was paying the most attention. The sound of Hale's voice when he was managing 3 simultaneous communications channels without losing a word of any of them. I thought about what it meant to carry them with me in this specific way. Not as abstract loss but as specific individuals, whose deaths had specific implications for the people who had known them, and the people who would have known them. I thought about what the war was for, not in the broad political sense which I understood, but in the specific personal sense of what it was doing and would continue to do to the people inside it. I decided in the cell several things I had been uncertain about before. I decided that if we won this war, I was going to recommend, loudly and repeatedly, that we do not occupy the Dominion. Not out of mercy, which would have been the wrong reason, but out of practical understanding that occupations breed exactly the kind of long-term instability that produces the conditions for the next war. We had history to look at. The history was clear. I decided that the Thessaly and whatever other species came forward were going to be treated as partners from the beginning, not as assets to be leveraged and managed. This was also practical. We needed what they had. But it was more than practical. It was right, and I had stopped seeing those as different categories sometime in the last few months. I decided that, when this was over, I was going to spend a significant amount of time with my daughter in Edinburgh, and we were going to go to that stationery shop again, and she was going to pick out another notebook. I was not going to write in this one for a long time after. These were the decisions I made in the cell, in the hours between the performance and the execution of the plan. The file transmitted. The names were still there. The decisions were still there. I held all of it as the hatch opened and Kara Webb's face appeared in the light. Kara Webb had been awake for 41 hours when she brought me the full analysis of the Veth communication archive, and I know this because I had been tracking her on the medical monitoring system. She came into my command room on the 3rd morning after my rescue with a tablet and 2 cups of coffee and set both down with the precision of someone who had decided the coffee was not optional for either of us. Then she opened the files and began. 3 hours later, I sat back and looked at the ceiling. Then I called Admiral Howard Crane at Earth Command, and we spent 6 hours designing Operation Long Memory. The name was mine. I had been thinking about it on the transit back from the Veth command vessel, in the hours after Webb handed me my notebook and before we reached the rendezvous point. I had been thinking about Velkorath in the cell, about the conversation on thresholds. I had been thinking about the clerk in the Veth archive, who would eventually have to update the record on humanity. I wanted the name to mean something specific to us even if the Veth never knew what it meant. We carried our dead with us. We were going to make sure that carrying them produced something. The plan was elegant in concept and required enormous precision in execution. 17 simultaneous strikes on 17 separate Veth frontier systems, every strike beginning within a 40-second window of the others. If any element was late or early by more than 40 seconds, the Veth command network, compromised as it was, would have sufficient time to begin routing responses. If all 17 hit at once, the network would receive 17 emergency signals simultaneously and have no mechanism to prioritize any of them. Kara Webb had spent 41 hours identifying where each of the 17 dominoes stood in the cascading sequence. Take this supply depot and you do not just lose the depot, you lose the resupply capacity for 4 patrol fleets. Take this communication relay and you do not just lose the relay, you lose the coordination between 3 frontier commands that depend on it for synchronized response. 17 targets chosen for what she called cascading utility rather than symbolic value. I led the strike on Kethvar, the Veth Forward Command station that served as the primary coordination hub for the Frontier Defense Network. The archive data gave us exact blind spot coordinates for their sensor array, maintained by the Veth themselves for maintenance scheduling purposes. We came in from 2 directions simultaneously, both in the blind spots, and had the communication relay destroyed in 4 minutes in the primary. Power generation offline in 11. The garrison fought hard. Every ship that could move kept moving and every weapon that could fire kept firing, until neither was possible. The Keth warrior caste did not reduce their effort when the situation became unfavorable. I want to record this accurately because I think it matters to record it accurately. They were very good at what they had been built for, and they did it completely, even losing. We lost the cairn. Captain Oliver Webb had volunteered for the strike team within 20 minutes of the briefing and had led from the front the entire engagement. His crew had 42 people. A Veth, firing coordination through a backup channel, caught the cairn when it was covering the withdrawal of 2 damaged ships, and the damage was catastrophic and immediate. I noted the time and the coordinates. I continued giving orders. Across 17 systems, the operation ran for 8 hours. When the final reports came in, 12 strikes had achieved complete success at the primary objective level. 4 had achieved partial success. 1 had been forced to withdraw after encountering a garrison force the archive data had not accounted for because a routine rotation 6 days prior had not yet been updated in the Veth files. 11 out of 17 on the primary objective. 16 out of 17 with significant secondary damage. The effect on Veth operations was immediate. Kara Webb monitored the fragmentary communications, still reaching us, through the compromised network, and described it as the difference between a functioning nervous system and one in shock. Orders went out and were not received. Ships requested instructions and received instructions that had been superseded. 3 separate frontier commands independently ordered the same resupply convoy to 3 different locations on the same day. Supply routes that had been maintained with precision for decades began running on outdated information because the systems that updated them were dark. We had not defeated the Veth fleet. We had introduced into its operations something it had no framework for, complete uncertainty about what was true. On the 4th day after the operation, my communications officer came to find me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. He said, "Commander, you need to hear this. There were 3 signals." I read all 3 and then sat quietly in my command room for a while. The Thessali had been watching the conflict since before we knew they existed. Their representative, whose name my translation software approximated as Aerith, spoke in a measured voice that had 60 years of patient endurance underneath it. She said the Thessali had spent 6 decades inside the Veth occupation building knowledge, a systematic and detailed body of intelligence about Veth logistics, infrastructure, personnel patterns, and strategic blind spots that no external source could have compiled. Because you only know certain things about a system when you are living inside it as a subject of it. They had been building this knowledge for a specific future purpose. They had been waiting for the demonstration that the Dominion could be hurt. The demonstration had been made. They would like to share what they had built. The Orin Collective communicated in a sensory format that my biology team spent 3 days partially characterizing and never fully understood. What mattered practically was the offer. Navigational knowledge of this region of space that predated the Veth Dominion itself. Every reliable jump corridor, every gravitational anomaly, every approach vector and dead end for hundreds of light years in every direction. Data that had never been available to any species in this region, because the Orin had simply been here the whole time, watching civilizations appear and change and sometimes end, and had decided that this particular moment was the one that warranted engagement. The Grath had been listed in our intelligence files as absorbed and non-functional as an independent species 40 years ago. This was incorrect. They had spent 40 years building, in complete secrecy, a communication relay network distributed through the margins of Veth-controlled space. Node by node, disguised as natural formations maintained through channels that mimicked debris movement patterns. 40 years of invisible, meticulous, patient construction, aimed at a single specific moment. They were ready to hand it to us complete, with full technical documentation. I sat with those 3 signals in my command room for a while. We had gone to war because we had been hurt, and because we had no other option. We had kept fighting, because stopping meant accepting a future where what happened to Callisto could happen again. We had fought alone because as far as we could see, we were the only species in this region fighting back against anything. We had not thought about what that looked like from outside our own perspective. We had been too occupied with surviving to have much bandwidth for perspective. What it looked like from outside was a door that had been locked for 60 years coming open. The Thessali had been waiting since their conquest. 60 years of endurance inside an occupation, building and maintaining the capacity for action without allowing that capacity to become action, prematurely, because premature action would have been crushed. The Grath had been building their relay network for 40 years, aimed at this moment. The Orin had been watching for longer than the Dominion had existed. All of them had been waiting for someone to demonstrate that the Dominion could be hurt. We had done that. I contacted each of the three through the channels they had provided, and told them all the same thing. We are glad you are here. We will not waste what you are offering. Every decision that affects your people will be made with your input, not announced to you after the fact. What you share with us we share back in kind. Arath, after a pause, said, most species in your position claim leadership. They do not offer partnership, I said. We are not most species. She said no. We are beginning to understand that. What partnership produced in practice was a transformation of the war that I had not planned and could not have planned and could only try to match with the best decisions available to me. Each day, the Thessaly supply chain intelligence gave us precise knowledge of every Veth convoy movement in the frontier zone. We hit 7 convoys in 1 week, each one timed to the data Arath's people provided. The Veth frontier fleet, already stretched by Operation Long Memory, began showing genuine material shortages for the first time. For the first time in 11 months, we were not responding to their operations. They were responding to ours. The Orin navigational data opened 3 approach vectors into core Dominion territory that appeared in no Veth chart because the Dominion had been administering these systems for a century without ever learning what the Orin knew about their gravitational structure. We used 2 of those vectors in the weeks that followed. We saved the 3rd for later. The Grath relay network changed our communication capacity entirely. We had been managing infrastructure that was vulnerable and required constant attention. The Grath network was invisible, distributed, tested for 40 years. With it, the Allied fleet began to function as a single coordinated force across the entire operational area for the first time. 3 weeks after the Grath relay came online, Velkorath's ceasefire request arrived at Earth Command. I read it with Crane on the encrypted channel and Kara Webb beside me. It was long by Veth standards. It acknowledged the current situation had developed beyond initial projections. It proposed cessation of hostilities pending formal negotiation. Crane said, "What do you think?" I thought about what a ceasefire preserved. The War Council intact, the shipyards damaged but operational, the fleet reduced but organized. 60 years of Thessaly occupation which a ceasefire would leave in place while negotiations proceeded. The Veth, 2 years from now, repaired and rebuilt and reassessing the calculation, I said. The only reason they want a ceasefire is because continuing has become unacceptable to them. The moment it becomes acceptable again, they will have every incentive to act on it. A ceasefire is not a solution. It is a pause while one side rebuilds, Crane said. That is the Earth Command assessment as well. The Allied Command meeting was the first to include Thessaly, Orin, and Grath representatives alongside human admirals. Arath laid out the Thessaly position without hesitation. A ceasefire that does not address occupied status, she said, is a request for time. We have given them 60 years of time. We will not give them more. We rejected the ceasefire without comment. 12 days later, the assault on the Veth manufacturing complex at Kisara began. I was in the planning room when the damage report came in. I read it and set it down and looked at the wall. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cole had been leading the boarding team at the facility's central control tower. The tower's automated defense grid had triggered on a timer rather than a sensor input, a failsafe that the intelligence data had not flagged. Cole had assessed the situation in 3 seconds. He pushed his team clear of the blast radius and took the full impact himself. His team made the objective. He did not come with them. He was from Oregon. His wife was Catherine. They had a dog. I knew the dog's name because he had mentioned it twice in casual conversation during long watch rotations when we had talked about home. And I am not writing it here yet because I am not ready to write it yet. I will write it when I am. I will find the right moment and write it in the notebook where it belongs alongside his name. I sat with the report for the length of time I could spare. It was not long enough. It was never long enough. Then I went back to work. That evening I wrote Ethan Cole's name in my notebook. I wrote it carefully. Then I opened the approach charts for Velanath. I sat with those charts for a long time. I thought about everything the war had cost and everything it had built. I thought about Arath saying most species in your position claim leadership. I thought about Velkorath in the cell, trying to build a model for something his entire training and experience had not prepared him to understand. I thought about why we had not stopped. It was not because we were more powerful or more intelligent than every previous species the Dominion had attempted to absorb. We had been outgunned in multiple engagements. We had taken losses that a species optimizing purely on survival calculus should have found unacceptable. The reason we had not stopped was the same reason I kept writing names in a notebook. Stopping meant accepting that those names had meant nothing. Every name was a reason the next name had to mean something. Every person I had written down was a debt that stopping would have left unpaid. Grief, in humans, does not produce surrender. I am not sure I can explain why. I have thought about it through many quiet hours of this war, and the best I can say is that grief and determination feed from the same source in us. They are not opposites. They are the same thing working in different directions at different moments. The Veth had given us grief. The grief had become the war. That was the thing their models had not accounted for. That was the mechanism Vel'Korath had not been able to find. I closed the approach charts. I took out my notebook and read through the names. Tomorrow, we were going to end this. The planning sessions for Velanath were the most complex coordination work I had been part of in my career. 840 ships from 4 species with different communication systems, different tactical traditions, and different physical requirements for their crews and vessels. The Orin navigational data required translation into formats that human, Thessali, and Grath pilots could interpret and act on, which was a technical problem that occupied 3 teams simultaneously for 2 weeks. The Grath relay network needed to be extended to cover the entire approach corridor, which required positioning relay nodes that were invisible to Veth sensors, which required using Thessali knowledge of Veth sensor parameters that had not previously been in any database we had access to. The logistical complexity was matched by the human complexity of coordinating with allied species in real time under combat conditions. Arath and I had a long conversation in the second week of planning about what the Thessali ships would and would not be able to do in the battle itself. Her people were not warriors. Their vessels were administrative and transport ships adapted to carry communication and sensor equipment. They were not designed to absorb weapons fire or execute combat maneuvers. She was clear about this with the direct precision I had come to expect from her. She said, "We can be useful in specific ways. We cannot be useful in the way you might wish we could be," I said. "Tell me the specific ways." She told me. I built the plan around what she told me. The Orin contributed their navigational capacity, and for the first time, something more. I do not know what to call what the Orin did with our communication systems during the 3 days before we jumped. The technical team said they were integrating their distributed intelligence into our coordination network. What it felt like, from my end, was that our communication suddenly had a depth and a precision it had not had before, like the difference between seeing something through murky water and seeing it clearly. Sutton said, "The targeting refinements that came through the Orin integration were unlike anything in standard UNDF doctrine," and asked me how he should think about them. I said, "Use them." He said, "Yes, Commander." The Grath sent 2 of their senior relay operators to work directly from the Relentless during the engagement. They arrived 3 days before we jumped and spent those 3 days in complete silence in the communications bay, which I was told was normal for them, that they communicated through the relay network at a level of detail and volume that they found it inefficient to translate into spoken language for situations that did not require it. One of them, the first day, came to find me in the command room and handed me a folded piece of material with symbols on it that my translation software could not fully render. The closest approximation was something like, "We are with you in this. We have been waiting for this." I kept it. It went in the same pocket as my notebook. Shaw came to my command room the night before we jumped. He sat down across from me and did not speak for a while, which was unlike him. Shaw was generally a person who spoke when he had something to say. The silence was something different. He said, eventually, "Do you think they knew, when they sent those 3 words, what they were starting?" I said, "No. I think they sent 3 words to a species they had categorized and assessed and found manageable, and they expected the words to produce the response that similar words had always produced. I think they genuinely did not understand what they were provoking," he said. "And now," I said, "now they know. They have known for a while. Vel'Korath understood it in the cell. The War Council understood it after long memory. The question is whether knowing it in time changes anything about the outcome." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want to come home. I want all of us to come home. I want there to be a home to come to," I said. "That is what we are going to go make possible." He nodded. He sat for a moment longer. Then he got up and he touched the door frame on his way out the way he had touched it before every major engagement, a habit I had noticed early in the war and never asked about. Some things you do not need to ask about. I sat alone in the command room for a while after he left. I thought about all of it, the 11 months, the names, the distance from that moment when I watched a locker door drift away from Callisto Station to this moment, Sitting in a command room surrounded by an allied fleet of 840 ships that had not existed 11 months ago, preparing to go to the Veth capital world, the distance was enormous, the cost of it was enormous. The weight of the names in my pocket was real in a way that was physical, not metaphorical. I felt it every day. I would feel it after tomorrow too. That was not going to change. But tomorrow there was a chance that it would have produced something that matched its weight. I was going to go make that happen. I went to sleep. The combined Allied fleet assembled over 3 weeks at a staging point far enough from Vel, a nath that we would not be detected until we chose to be. 840 ships. Human vessels alongside Thessali ships that moved with a precision born from 60 years of watching Veth formation doctrine and learning to anticipate it. Orin-piloted craft that traveled in ways our navigational software still could not fully model, following gravitational paths that were invisible to everything except the Orin's understanding of space, which was different from ours in ways we were still working to comprehend. Grath-crewed ships communicating through their relay network in real time, coordinating with each other in something that was less like formation flying and more like distributed thought. And in the center of it, the relentless, patched and repaired and operational, with a crew that had been together through 11 months of continuous operations and looked every day of it. I walked the ship the evening before we jumped. This was something I had started doing before major engagements months into the war, and had not stopped. I walked every corridor and every deck, and I looked at the people I passed, and I talked with anyone who met my eyes. Not speeches, not inspiration, just conversation. How are you? How is the equipment? Tell me something you noticed that I should know about. A young engineer named Claire Hartley, no relation to Jeff, showed me a repair she had made to a conduit junction on Deck 4 that she was proud of. She explained it in detail I could not fully follow but listened to completely. A gunner named Filisante told me he had been writing letters to his younger brother every day since the war started, and planned to send them all at once when it was over. He said his brother had 2 children, and they would be old enough to read them by the time they arrived, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to go. I stopped in the medical bay. Dr. Holt was reviewing her supply inventory, which she reviewed every day, regardless of whether anything had changed. She looked up when I came in and looked at me for a moment, with the direct assessing attention she had used on me for 12 years. She said, "How are you actually?" I sat on one of the examination beds. I said, "I have been doing this for 11 months and there are names in my notebook. Still cannot say aloud without something happening to my voice. I am tired in a way that is different from physical tiredness, and I am going to do this tomorrow. Because there is no alternative I can live with, and because the people in this fleet deserve a commander who can hold what needs to be held, and keep functioning. So the answer is that I am ready and also that I am not entirely intact, and both of those things are true at the same time." Holt looked at me. She said, "Good. Being not entirely intact means you have been paying attention." I went back to my cabin. I looked at Velanath's direction in the viewport. Too far to see, but I knew where it was. I took out my notebook and read through every name. I did not do this to feel it. I did it because those names were the reason for tomorrow, and I wanted to face tomorrow with the reasons clear. I put the notebook back. In the morning we jumped. The Battle of Velanath lasted 11 hours and 9 minutes. The opening was hard. The Veth had known we were coming for at least 6 hours before we arrived, enough time to position their orbital platforms, and coordinate the garrison fleet, and make every preparation their damaged but still functional command structure could execute. The first 20 minutes were the worst of the entire war. Concentrated fire from 3 directions before we had established a stable attack angle. We lost 4 ships in that first 20 minutes, and I kept my voice even, and kept giving orders, and trusted the fleet to do what it had spent 11 months learning to do. The Thessali did something in the first hour that I had not anticipated, because Aerith had not told me to anticipate it. Their ships were not combat vessels. They had never been designed for this kind of engagement. But they moved to positions that the Orin navigational data identified as specific gravitational nodes in the orbital approach pattern, and from those nodes they began broadcasting Veth command signals on the frequencies the garrison ships were using for coordination. The signals were exactly correct in format, frequency, and authentication codes. The command codes were correct. The orders they carried were not. The Thessali had spent 60 years inside Veth administrative systems. They knew the command structure the way you know a building you have worked in for decades. Every room and every corridor and every access point and every system and which ones would respond to which inputs. The orders they broadcast were not dramatic. They were small, routine, individually unremarkable. A patrol element repositioning to a secondary formation point. A supply escort returning to the secondary bay for inspection. A garrison unit holding position pending clarification of conflicting directives. Small orders. Individually, each one looked like normal operational communication. Together, over the course of 3 hours, they created a gap in the Veth defensive formation that had not been planned for and was not detected until too late. We went through the gap at hour 7. The second orbital platform went dark at hour 8. The first had gone dark at hour 5 during a combined strike using Orin navigational calculations that treated Velanath's 2 moons as gravitational slingshots, approach vectors the Veth had never modeled because the geometry required knowledge of the gravitational structure they did not have. The planetary shield dropped to 40% at hour 9. I watched it on my board and noticed, briefly and without being able to prevent it, a clear and specific respect for the engineering team somewhere on that planet, still working to hold the shield at 40%. People doing their job in exactly the way my crew was doing theirs, because that is what people do when they have a function and a reason to perform it. I acknowledged the thought and went back to the battle. At hour 10, the Veth garrison fleet began pulling toward the southern hemisphere. Shaw landed at hour 10:30 and came directly to the command deck in his flight suit. His left arm had a new burn mark alongside the old one. He stood at the back of the bridge and watched the displays without speaking. I did not ask how he was. I could see how he was. At hour 11, Vel Korath's voice came through on the channel, even and precise, carrying its age in the careful spacing between words. He said he was requesting the formal cessation of hostilities under the Second Compact of Velanath, the Dominion's traditional framework for ending declared conflicts. I said, I accept your request. State your terms. They are unconditional. The bridge went completely silent. Hale's hands were flat on his console. Sutton had stopped moving. I was aware of Shaw at the back of the room. I was aware of my own hands, very still on the arms of my command chair. I said, send the formal documentation to my command terminal. We will conduct the ceremony according to Veth traditional protocol for the end of a conflict between powers of equal standing. A pause, he said. You know Veth ceremony protocol. I said I studied everything I could find, he said. You continue to be difficult to anticipate, Commander Osi, I said. I am aware. He closed the channel. I had argued for conducting the ceremony on Veth terms in the Allied command meeting for 2 hours. Some people thought it was unnecessary, a detail that could be set aside given everything else that needed to be managed in the immediate aftermath. I said, we are not ending this war with humiliation. The Veth ceremony for the end of a conflict between equal standing powers is specific about what that means. We are conducting it that way because how we end this matters as much as that we end it. A peace you build on humiliation is not peace. It is a different kind of war waiting for a start date. Erath, in that meeting, had looked at me for a long moment. Then she had looked at the Grath representatives and the Orin display and then back at me. She said, yes, this is what we support. Vel Korath came aboard the Relentless 3 days later with 6 staff members. He walked through my docking bay and into the main conference room, and I met him at the door. He was taller than I remembered from the cell. The weariness that had been in him then had deepened. He looked at me and I looked at him, and we stood for a moment. 2 people who had spent a year trying to understand each other through the medium of a war. He held out the seal of the Dominion War Council in both hands. Dense metal, warm from his hands. I took it, he said, in careful translated standard. We studied 100 species. We did not study you well enough. I held the seal. I said, you studied what you expected to find. We are something else. He said, that is an accurate summary. I said, we are going to help you rebuild. The stillness that went through him was different from any stillness I had catalogued from him before. This one was not controlled. It was genuine. He said, why? I said, because the people who live in the frontier systems that were damaged in this war are not the War Council. They did not choose this conflict. A stable and functioning Dominion is better for every species in this region than a ruined one. We have enough of our own history to know what grows in the space left by pure victory, if that victory is not followed by something constructive. We do not want to spend the next generation building the conditions for the next war while we are still in the aftermath of this one. He said, your species is very strange, I said. I know, he said. Is this what you do? You fight someone and then help them recover? I said, we try to. We do not always succeed. But we try because the alternative, in our own history, has not worked as well as we wanted it to, and we have records going back a long time. He made a gesture I did not recognize, a small movement of his hands at waist height. His aide leaned forward and said quietly in translated standard, That is used when something is new information being accepted as true. I said, I will accept that. The work of the peace was harder in some ways than the work of the war. War has a direction. It moves forward in a way you can track and measure. Peace requires you to hold multiple contradictory things simultaneously and keep moving anyway. It requires you to work with people you fought against as if the future matters more than the past, which is something humans know how to do when we choose to and fail to do when we do not, and the choosing is not automatic. The Allied Transitional Authority met for the first time at a neutral station in a system not affiliated with any of the parties. Arath arrived with a 3-person Thessali team, and in the first session, laid out the most comprehensive framework for transitioning occupied territories to self-governance that I had seen from any source. She had been building it for 15 years, she said, in the margins of time the occupation allowed, because she had believed this moment would come and she had wanted it to be ready when it did. I watched her work and I thought about patience of a kind I did not have the full architecture to understand. 60 years of occupation. 15 years of preparation for a meeting that might never have happened. And when it happened, she showed up with a finished document. The Veth representatives at the table were administrators, not War Council members. People who had been managing the practical systems of the Dominion while the War Council ran the war. They were not apologetic and not warm, but they were practical in the way that professionals are practical about the work in front of them. They wanted the systems to function. That was something to build on. The Oran's navigational contributions to the shared infrastructure plan would make reliable trade and resupply viable across the former occupied systems within 2 years. The Grath communication network was being formalized from a military asset into shared civilian infrastructure, which changed its political valence entirely and made it a resource rather than a tool. Crane called from Earth Command 3 weeks in and asked for my assessment of long-term stability prospects. I said, better than anyone has a right to expect and worse than we would like. The Thessali framework is sound. The economic integration plan is viable. The hard part is the Veth cultural adjustment, which will take generations and will not be linear, he said. And your honest estimate of whether they try again. I said, not for 50 years if we do this right. Possibly never if the transitional generation grows up in a system that works for them better than the old one did. No guarantee. But the best odds we have is building something genuinely better than what was there before and being patient about the results. He said, the Security Council was hoping for more certainty. I said, I know. I do not have more certainty than that. Nobody does. He said, fair enough. 4 months after the surrender, I took the Relentless back to the outer solar system. I wanted to see Callisto. The debris field was gone, as I had known it would be. There was nothing visible where the station had been. Jupiter's storms moved in the same slow ancient patterns they had always moved in. The space around its northern pole was the same space it had always been, indifferent and cold and full of the particular silence that has no sound source to interrupt it. I stood at the viewport for a long time. I thought about Aerith at the end of the last planning session, when the framework had been agreed, and the first supply convoys were being organized, and the Transitional Authority had held its first fully formal session with Veth administrators participating. She had stood at the end of the table and looked around the room, at the humans and the Thessali and the Oran display, and the Grath and the Veth, administrators who had voted to join the process, and she had said something in her own language. The translation came through. So it was possible after all. She had said it quietly, to herself as much as to anyone. The voice of someone who had believed something for 60 years without being entirely certain it was true, and had just found out that it was. I went back to my cabin. I took out my notebook and opened it to the first page. I read every name from the beginning. Jeff Hartley, the Argent and the Wren, Oliver Webb and his 42, Commander Barry Sutton, whose children's photographs I had taken down from his console after the engagement where he died and sent home with his personal effects. Ethan Cole, and the dog's name. I wrote it. I was ready to write it now. I had waited until I was ready and I was ready. It went next to Ethan Cole's name in the notebook, the way it would have gone next to him anywhere. And all the others between and after them, every person I had written with the date and the place, and what I knew about who they had been. I read them all the way through twice. Then I wrote the new entries. I wrote Aerith's words, so it was possible after all. I wrote the sounds as closely as I could approximate them, then the translation underneath. I wrote the text of the updated Veth archive entry that Kara Webb had obtained from the Dominion Administrative Database 6 weeks after the surrender. Species designation updated. Previous classification, Class 4 emergent, new classification. Species of indeterminate ceiling. Additional notation. Behavior in complex multi-species political environments marked as unpredictable. Recommend extended observation period. Do not engage without full council authorization. I held that phrase for a moment. Do not engage without full council authorization. 400 years of unbroken expansion. 112 species cataloged and absorbed. And then a new category that had to be invented because nothing in the taxonomy had a slot for us. I wrote